The slap echoed through courtroom 4B like a gunshot. Officer Derek Hastings' palm connected with the woman's face so hard that her head snapped to the side, and the entire Baltimore County Courthouse fell silent. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The elegant black woman in the tailored charcoal suit didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She simply touched her cheek, looked Derek dead in the eye, and said in a voice that could cut steel, "Officer Hastings, you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." What Derek didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew except for a select few, was that this woman wasn't just another witness. She wasn't just another face in the crowd of people Derek had spent 15 years disrespecting, intimidating, and abusing. This was Captain Simone Wallace. And in exactly 7 days, she would walk through the doors of Baltimore County Police Headquarters as their new police chief. The first black woman to ever hold that position. But right now, in this moment, Derek Hastings had no idea that he had just slapped his future boss in open court, in front of a judge, in front of bailiffs, in front of cameras that captured everything. The bailiff swarmed Derek immediately. 2 grabbed his arms while a 3rd moved to block him from Simone. Judge Patricia Henderson's gavel came down so hard it might have cracked the sound block. "Officer Hastings. You are in contempt of this court. Bailiffs, remove him immediately." Derek was still yelling as they dragged him toward the courtroom doors, his face red, his voice hoarse with rage and disbelief. "She's lying. They're all lying. You people always protect each other. I'm a cop. I'm a 15-year officer. You can't do this to me." But they could. And they were. And what Derek still didn't understand, what would take days for him to fully comprehend, was that this wasn't just about contempt of court. This wasn't just about assaulting a witness. This was about justice that had been building for years, for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And karma? Karma has perfect timing. Let's rewind. Let's go back to how we got here. Because Simone Wallace wasn't even supposed to be in that courtroom as a defendant. She had been called as a character witness for her younger brother, Marcus Wallace, who stood accused of assaulting a police officer. An accusation that Simone knew in her bones was fabricated. An accusation that followed a pattern she had seen 100 times in her 22 years of police work. And the officer making that accusation? Derek Hastings. The same Derek Hastings who had just committed career suicide in front of a room full of witnesses. 4 days earlier, Simone had walked into courtroom 4B for the first time. The trial of Marcus Wallace versus the state of Maryland had been going on for 3 days already, and the defense attorney, Rebecca Lawson, had been systematically dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece. Marcus sat at the defense table in a borrowed suit, his hands folded, his eyes tired but determined. Next to him sat his fiancée, Keisha, who hadn't left his side since this nightmare began. And across the aisle, at the prosecution table, sat Officer Derek Hastings, watching his lies collapse in real time. Simone entered quietly, took a seat in the gallery, and observed. She watched as Rebecca Lawson questioned witnesses, pointed out inconsistencies in police reports, and introduced evidence that contradicted everything Derek claimed happened that night in July. She watched as Derek's jaw clenched tighter with each piece of evidence, each witness testimony, each moment that exposed the truth. And she knew, with the certainty that comes from 2 decades of investigating corrupt officers, that Derek Hastings was exactly the kind of cop she had spent her career trying to remove from the force. When Simone's turn came to testify, she walked to the witness stand with the same calm confidence she brought to every aspect of her life. The bailiff swore her in. She placed her hand on the Bible, stated her full name, and sat down. Rebecca Lawson approached with a gentle smile. "Ms. Wallace, can you tell the court about your relationship with the defendant, Marcus Wallace?" "Marcus is my younger brother," Simone said, her voice clear and steady. "We grew up together in West Baltimore. Our mother raised us after our father passed when Marcus was 6 and I was 10. She worked 2 jobs to keep us fed, clothed, and in school. She taught us to respect authority, to work hard, and to always stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." "Can you describe Marcus's character for the court?" Simone looked at her brother, and for just a moment, her professional mask softened. "Marcus is one of the gentlest people I know. He's patient, kind, and thoughtful. He's been working at Henderson's Auto Repair for 7 years. He volunteers every Saturday morning at the youth center on Monument Street, teaching kids basic car maintenance so they can get jobs when they're older. He's never been in trouble with the law. Not even a speeding ticket. The idea that Marcus would assault anyone, let alone a police officer, goes against everything I know about who he is." Rebecca nodded. "And in your professional opinion, having known your brother his entire life, do you believe he's capable of the violence he's accused of?" "No," Simone said firmly. "I don't believe it for a second." The prosecutor, a tired-looking man named Gerald Fisher, declined to cross-examine. He knew what the jury had already seen. The gas station surveillance footage showed everything. Derek Hastings yanking Marcus from his vehicle without cause. Derek slamming Marcus against the hood. Derek punching Marcus in the ribs when Marcus asked what he was being arrested for. The footage was clear. The lies were obvious. Cross-examining Marcus's sister about his character wasn't going to change that. Judge Henderson thanked Simone. "You may step down, Ms. Wallace." Simone stood, smoothed her suit jacket, and began walking back toward the gallery. She passed the jury box, where 12 faces watched her with expressions ranging from sympathy to anger at what they had witnessed during this trial. She passed the court reporter, still typing away. And then she passed the prosecution table, where Derek Hastings sat with his arms crossed, his face twisted with barely contained rage. That's when Derek stood up. The movement was sudden enough that everyone noticed. Simone paused, turned slightly to look at him, and that's when he said it. Loud enough for everyone to hear. Loud enough that there would be no mistaking his words. "You people always stick together, don't you?" The courtroom went still. Simone stopped completely now, turning to face Derek directly. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Excuse me, officer?" Derek took a step closer to the railing that separated the prosecution table from the open courtroom floor. His voice dripped with contempt. "You heard me. You and your brother, playing the victim card. Making everything about race. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of people like you crying wolf every time you don't get your way." Judge Henderson's gavel came down. "Officer Hastings. That is completely inappropriate. You will control yourself in my courtroom." But Derek was past the point of control. 15 years of getting away with complaints, of having his union representative spin his misconduct, of watching internal affairs investigations disappear into bureaucratic black holes, all of it had built up this sense of invincibility. This arrogance. This belief that his badge made him untouchable. He looked at Simone, and all he saw was another black woman who dared to challenge his authority. Another person who needed to be put in their place. "You know what your problem is?" Derek continued, his voice rising. "You think you're special. You think the rules don't apply to you. Well, I've got news for you, lady. Your brother assaulted me. I don't care how many character witnesses you parade through here. I don't care what some grainy gas station video supposedly shows. I was there. I know what happened. And I'm not going to stand here and let you people make me out to be the bad guy." "Officer Hastings." Judge Henderson was standing now, her face flushed with anger. "One more word and you will be removed from this courtroom." Simone opened her mouth to respond. Not to argue, not to escalate, but simply to say what she had been trained to say in situations like this, that the jury would decide the truth based on evidence, not emotion. But before she could speak, Derek's hand flew up. Fast. Violent. Unthinking. His palm connected with Simone's face with a crack that seemed to echo off every wall in that courtroom. Simone's head turned with the force of the blow. A red mark bloomed across her cheek. But she didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. She simply stood there, one hand slowly rising to touch her face, and looked at Derek Hastings with an expression that was somehow more terrifying than any show of anger could have been. It was the look of someone who had just watched their opponent seal their own fate. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. It was the look of perfect, controlled fury. "Officer Hastings," Simone said quietly, her voice steady despite the burning pain in her cheek, "you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." And that's when the bailiffs moved. 3 of them converged on Derek at once, grabbing his arms, forcing him back from the railing. Derek was shouting now, his voice cracking with desperation. "Get your hands off me! I'm a police officer. She provoked me. You all saw it. She was disrespecting the court. I was defending the integrity of law enforcement." Judge Henderson was on her feet, her gavel coming down again and again. "Bailiffs, remove Officer Hastings from my courtroom immediately. He is hereby held in contempt. I want him placed in a holding cell until we can schedule a hearing on these charges." As the bailiffs dragged Derek toward the doors, he craned his neck to look back at Simone. "This isn't over. I know people. I have connections. You think you can just walk in here and destroy a cop's reputation? You have no idea who you're dealing with." But he was wrong. Simone knew exactly who she was dealing with. She had investigated officers like Derek Hastings for years. She knew their patterns, their excuses, their networks of protection. And she knew something else too. Something that Derek wouldn't find out until it was far too late. In 7 days, Simone Wallace would walk into Baltimore County Police Headquarters as the new chief of police. And every single officer in that department, including Derek Hastings, would answer to her. Rebecca Lawson approached Simone as the courtroom slowly settled back into order. "Are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Simone shook her head, still touching her cheek where the mark was darkening. I'm fine. I've had worse. Marcus stood up from the defense table, his eyes wide with shock and anger. Simone, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't... Stop, Simone said, turning to her brother. This isn't your fault. This is about a corrupt officer who finally went too far. And trust me, Marcus, he's going to pay for it. Rebecca leaned in close, lowering her voice. Your official appointment gets announced next week, doesn't it? Simone's lips curved into the smallest, coldest smile. Monday morning. 7 days from now. Marcus's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Then, for the first time in weeks, since this entire nightmare began, he smiled. Really smiled. 3 weeks before that slap echoed through courtroom 4B, Officer Derek Hastings sat in his patrol car on a quiet street in Dundalk, eating a sandwich and scrolling through his phone. His partner, Officer Luis Mendoza, sat in the passenger seat, filling out paperwork from their last call. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of humid July night where the air felt thick enough to chew. Derek took a bite of his sandwich, glanced at Luis, and said something that would later haunt Luis for months to come. You know what I love about this job? Derek said, wiping mustard from his mouth. The power. The respect. People see this badge and they know to stay in line. Especially the ones who need reminding about where they belong in the world. Luis didn't respond. He had learned over the past 2 years of riding with Derek that sometimes silence was the safest option. Because Derek Hastings wasn't just a cop with a bad attitude. Derek was something far more dangerous. He was a corrupt officer who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of abuse while staying just barely within the lines that would get him fired. 17 official complaints had been filed against Derek over the years. 17. Excessive force. Falsifying reports. Racial profiling. Witness intimidation. And yet Derek still wore his uniform. Still carried his badge. Still patrolled the streets with the full authority of the Baltimore County Police Department behind him. How does someone like Derek Hastings survive 17 complaints? The answer was simple and depressing. Connections. Derek had friends in the union, friends in internal affairs, friends in the district attorney's office. He had a union representative named Tom Carlisle who could spin any incident, no matter how damning, into a misunderstanding or a case of an officer just doing his job under difficult circumstances. Derek knew which supervisors would look the other way, which judges would give cops the benefit of the doubt, and which prosecutors would never push too hard against law enforcement. But more than that, Derek understood the system. He knew how to write reports that sounded just plausible enough. He knew how to coach witnesses into giving statements that supported his version of events. He knew that body cameras could malfunction at convenient times, and that even when they didn't, the footage could be interpreted in ways that protected officers. Derek had turned corruption into a science, and for 15 years, he had gotten away with it. Luis Mendoza knew all of this. Luis had tried to report Derek twice in the past 18 months. The first time was after Derek beat a suspect during an arrest so badly that the man needed 12 stitches. Luis had gone to their sergeant, a man named Bill Morrison, and explained what he saw. Morrison had listened, nodded, and then said something that Luis would never forget. Look, Mendoza, I get it. Derek can be rough around the edges. But he gets results. He closes cases. And in this department, that matters. You want to be known as the guy who rats out his partner? You want every cop in this precinct to wonder if you'll do the same to them? Be a team player. Learn to work with different styles. The second time Luis tried to report Derek was after he watched Derek plant evidence during a drug bust. A baggie of cocaine that definitely hadn't been in the suspect's pocket suddenly appeared during the search. Luis saw Derek slip it in with his own eyes. This time Luis went to internal affairs. He filled out the paperwork, gave his statement, and waited. 3 weeks later, an IA investigator named Karen Schultz called him into an office and told him the investigation had been closed. Insufficient evidence. Conflicting accounts. No corroboration. The subtext was clear: your word against a 15-year officer with a stack of commendations isn't going to go anywhere. Drop it. So Luis dropped it. He stopped reporting. He stopped objecting. He started doing what Derek told him to do, writing what Derek told him to write, and keeping his mouth shut. Luis told himself he was protecting his family. He had a wife, 2 kids in middle school, and a mortgage on a modest house in Essex. He couldn't afford to lose his job. He couldn't afford to become a pariah in the department. He couldn't afford to be the cop that other cops refused to back up when things got dangerous. And so Luis became complicit. He became part of the problem he had once wanted to fix. But every night, when Luis went home and kissed his kids goodnight, he felt the weight of it. The shame. The guilt. The knowledge that his silence was allowing Derek to keep hurting people. Luis started keeping a private record. Nothing official. Just notes on his phone, dates and times, brief descriptions of incidents. He told himself that someday, when the time was right, when he had enough evidence, when he could do it safely, he would come forward. But weeks turned into months, and Luis kept riding with Derek, kept watching him abuse his power, and kept saying nothing. Now, on this humid Tuesday evening in July, Derek finished his sandwich, crumpled up the wrapper, and pointed through the windshield at a car pulling out of a parking lot half a block ahead. "That one," Derek said. "Let's pull him over." Luis looked at the car. It was a Honda Civic, maybe 10 years old, well maintained. Nothing suspicious. No erratic driving. No obvious violations. "What's the cause?" Luis asked. Derek grinned. "Brake lights out." Luis looked more closely. Both brake lights were clearly working. "Derek, I can see both lights from here." "Not after we pull him over, you won't." Luis felt his stomach drop. This was how it always started. Derek would claim some minor violation, pull someone over, and then escalate the situation until he had an excuse to make an arrest. And 9 times out of 10, the person Derek targeted was black. This wasn't policing. This was hunting. And Luis was about to watch it happen again. Derek flipped on the patrol car's lights and pulled out behind the Honda. The car slowed, turned on its signal, and pulled over to the curb in a calm, controlled manner. Exactly what you're supposed to do when a cop pulls you behind you. Derek parked the patrol car, checked his gun, and glanced at Luis. "Stay sharp. You never know with these people." The driver of the Honda rolled down his window as Derek approached. Luis got out and stood by the patrol car, watching. The driver was a black man in his late 20s, wearing a mechanic's uniform with a name patch that read Marcus. He kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, exactly like you're supposed to do. His voice was calm and polite as Derek leaned down to the window. "Good evening, officer. Was I doing something wrong?" "License and registration," Derek said, his tone already aggressive. "Your brake light is out." Marcus glanced in his rearview mirror, clearly confused. "Sir, I just had my car serviced last week. I don't think there's anything wrong with my lights." "Are you arguing with me?" "No, sir. I'm just saying I don't think." "Step out of the vehicle." Luis felt his chest tighten. This was happening too fast. There was no reason to ask the driver to exit the vehicle for a brake light violation. No reason except that Derek wanted to escalate. Marcus hesitated, and Luis could see the calculation happening in his mind. The same calculation every black man in America has to make when dealing with police. Do I comply and hope for the best? Do I stand up for my rights and risk things getting worse? Do I film this? Do I call someone? What's the safest play here? Marcus chose compliance. He slowly opened his door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. "Sir, can you tell me what this is about? I haven't done anything wrong." Derek grabbed Marcus by the arm and spun him around, pushing him against the hood of the Honda. "I said step out of the vehicle. I didn't say ask questions." "Officer, please, I'm cooperating." "You're resisting." "I'm not resisting, I'm just asking." That's when Derek punched Marcus in the ribs. Hard. Marcus gasped, tried to pull away, and Derek slammed him harder against the hood. Luis stood frozen by the patrol car, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio, toward anything that might stop this, but his body wouldn't obey. He thought about his kids. He thought about his mortgage. He thought about Karen Schultz from Internal Affairs telling him his report was closed due to insufficient evidence. Suspect became aggressive and combative, Derek shouted, loud enough for Luis to hear clearly. "Attempted to assault me. I'm taking him into custody." Marcus's voice was strained, pained, confused. "I didn't do anything. I didn't touch you." Derek yanked Marcus's arms behind his back and cuffed him. Then Derek looked directly at Luis, his eyes cold and challenging. "You saw him assault me, right, partner?" This was the moment. This was always the moment. Every time Derek crossed the line, he forced Luis to make a choice. Tell the truth and destroy your career, or lie and stay safe. Luis looked at Marcus, saw the fear and betrayal in his eyes, saw a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong being arrested for a crime that never happened. Luis opened his mouth, and the word that came out was the word that would haunt him for weeks to come. "Yeah. I saw it." Derek smiled. "Good. Let's get him processed." Marcus spent that night in a cell at Baltimore County Detention Center. By morning, he was being charged with assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and failure to comply with lawful orders. Felony charges. The kind of charges that could destroy a life. Cost him his job. Cost him his freedom. All because Derek Hastings decided to pull him over for a brake light that wasn't even broken. But what Derek didn't know was that there had been a witness. The gas station across the street from where the stop happened had surveillance cameras pointed toward the street. The owner, a Korean immigrant named Mr. Kim who had his own history of bad encounters with Derek Hastings, had watched the whole thing on his security monitor. And when Marcus's fiancée, Keisha, came looking for anyone who might have seen what happened, Mr. Kim burned her a copy of the footage and told her to get Marcus a good lawyer. That footage made its way to Rebecca Lawson, a former prosecutor who had left the district attorney's office after becoming disgusted with how many times she was pressured to give cops a pass on obvious misconduct. Rebecca watched the footage 3 times, felt the familiar anger rising in her chest, and took Marcus's case pro bono. She knew exactly what she was dealing with. She had seen officers like Derek Hastings before. And she knew how to beat them in court. But Rebecca also knew that Marcus would need more than just video evidence and good legal representation. He would need character witnesses. People who could testify to who Marcus really was, not the violent criminal Derek was trying to paint him as. That's when Keisha called Marcus's sister. The sister Marcus hadn't wanted to burden with this mess. The sister who worked in law enforcement herself and might face conflicts of interest. The sister who had built a 22-year career on integrity and justice. Simone Wallace answered the phone on the second ring. She was in her office at Baltimore City Police Headquarters, reviewing case files for an internal affairs investigation into an officer accused of taking bribes from drug dealers. When Keisha explained what happened to Marcus, Simone closed her eyes and felt the familiar burn of anger that came from knowing the system she served was protecting officers who had no business wearing a badge. "Keisha, listen to me carefully," Simone said, her voice calm but firm. "Get Marcus a lawyer. A good one. Someone who specializes in police misconduct. I can't get involved officially because of jurisdictional issues, but I will do everything I can to help. Tell Marcus not to talk to anyone without his attorney present. Not other inmates, not guards, nobody. And tell him I love him and this isn't over." What Simone didn't tell Keisha was that she had just received a phone call that very morning. A phone call from the Baltimore County Board of Commissioners offering her the position of police chief. The first black woman to ever lead the department. Simone's official start date would be 3 weeks away. 3 weeks from the day Marcus was arrested. And Officer Derek Hastings, the corrupt cop who had just destroyed her brother's life based on lies, had no idea that very soon he would be answering directly to the woman whose family he had just torn apart. Simone Wallace believed in justice. She believed in the system, even when the system failed. She believed that good cops outnumbered bad cops, and that accountability mattered. But she also believed in something else. She believed in karma. And as she hung up the phone with Keisha and stared at the Baltimore County Police Chief contract sitting on her desk waiting for her signature, Simone knew that karma was about to catch up with Derek Hastings in a way he could never anticipate. The trial of Marcus Wallace began on a Monday morning in late July, and from the very first moment, it was clear that this wasn't going to be the easy win Derek Hastings expected. Rebecca Lawson walked into that courtroom like a woman on a mission, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with evidence, witness statements, and most importantly, the surveillance footage that would blow Derek's entire story apart. She wore a navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in a professional bun, and when she looked at Derek sitting at the prosecution table, her expression was pure ice. The jury was seated. 12 Baltimore County residents who had been selected over 2 long days of questioning. Rebecca had fought to keep anyone with strong pro-police bias off that jury, and she had largely succeeded. What she ended up with was a diverse group of people who seemed genuinely willing to consider the evidence rather than automatically believing whatever a cop said on the witness stand. That was all she needed. Because once this jury saw what Rebecca had to show them, there would be no question about who was telling the truth. The prosecutor, Gerald Fisher, opened with a standard argument. Officer Derek Hastings was a decorated member of the Baltimore County Police Department with 15 years of service. He had pulled over Marcus Wallace for a routine traffic violation. Marcus became aggressive. Marcus refused to comply with lawful orders. And when Derek attempted to place Marcus under arrest, Marcus struck him in the chest. Everything Derek did was by the book, necessary, and completely justified. Marcus Wallace was simply another criminal who thought he could assault a police officer and get away with it by crying racism. Rebecca's opening statement was different. She didn't yell. She didn't pound the table. She simply told the jury a story. A story about a man named Marcus Wallace who worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and was driving home from his job as a mechanic when he was pulled over for a violation that never existed. She told them about an officer who had 17 complaints filed against him over 15 years. She told them about a system that protected bad cops while destroying innocent lives. And she promised them that by the end of this trial, they would see with their own eyes exactly what happened on that street corner in July. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca said, looking each juror in the eye, "this case isn't about whether police officers deserve respect. They do. It's not about whether officers sometimes face dangerous situations that require split-second decisions. They do. This case is about one officer, Derek Hastings, who abused his power, fabricated charges, and tried to send an innocent man to prison to cover up his own misconduct. And I'm going to prove it to you." The first 2 days of trial were brutal for Derek. Rebecca called witness after witness who testified about his pattern of behavior. She brought in 4 people who Derek had arrested over the years on charges that were later dismissed or reduced. Each one told a similar story. Derek pulled them over for minor violations or no violations at all. Derek escalated situations that didn't need to be escalated. Derek used force that wasn't necessary. And Derek always wrote reports that made himself look like the hero and the suspect look like the villain. Gerald Fisher objected repeatedly, arguing that past complaints weren't relevant to this specific case. But Judge Patricia Henderson, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s who had been on the bench for 20 years, allowed the testimony. "The defendant has a right to establish a pattern of behavior," she ruled. Objection overruled. Derek sat at the prosecution table, his face getting redder with each testimony. His lawyer, a public defender named Sharon Yates who had been assigned to assist the prosecution as a legal advisor, kept whispering to him to stay calm, to not react, to let Fisher handle it. But Derek wasn't good at staying calm. Derek's entire career had been built on intimidation, on making people afraid to challenge him. And now he was sitting in a courtroom where he couldn't intimidate anyone, where his badge meant nothing, where people were telling the truth about him and there was nothing he could do to stop it. On the third day of trial, Rebecca played the surveillance footage. She had it transferred to a large monitor that faced the jury box, and she played it 3 times. The first time, she played it without comment, letting the jury see the entire interaction from start to finish. The second time, she paused at key moments and pointed out specific details. The brake lights on Marcus's car, both clearly working. Derek approaching the vehicle with his hand already on his weapon. Marcus keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. Derek ordering Marcus out of the car without any legal justification. Marcus complying slowly and carefully. Derek grabbing Marcus and slamming him against the hood. Marcus asking what he was being arrested for. And then, clear as day, Derek punching Marcus in the ribs. "Now watch Officer Hastings's body language here," Rebecca said, pausing the video at the moment right after the punch. "He looks directly at his partner, Officer Luis Mendoza, who is standing by the patrol car. And what does Officer Hastings do? He shouts something. The audio isn't clear, but we have testimony about what he said. He said, 'Suspect became aggressive and combative. Attempted to assault me.' He's creating the narrative. He's establishing the false justification for the arrest. And then he looks at Officer Mendoza and makes sure his partner heard it." The jury watched in silence. Several of them were leaning forward, studying every detail. One woman in the back row had her arms crossed, her face set in an expression of clear disgust. An older black man in the front row shook his head slowly. Rebecca let the video speak for itself because the video was damning. There was no assault. There was no resistance. There was only a cop abusing his power and a civilian trying desperately to survive the encounter without getting hurt worse than he already was. Gerald Fisher did his best during cross-examination of Rebecca's witnesses, but there wasn't much he could do. The video existed. The pattern existed. The complaints existed. All Fisher could really argue was that maybe the video didn't show the full context, maybe there were threats or movements that the camera didn't capture, maybe Derek genuinely believed he was in danger. But it was weak and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Then came Derek's turn to testify. This was the moment Fisher had been dreading, because he knew Derek wasn't good on the witness stand. Derek was arrogant, defensive, and couldn't hide his contempt for anyone who questioned him. But they had no choice. The prosecution's entire case rested on Derek's credibility, and without his testimony, there was nothing to contradict the surveillance footage. Derek took the stand wearing his dress uniform, his badge polished, his posture rigid. Fisher walked him through the events of that night, and Derek recited his version like he had practiced it 100 times. He pulled Marcus over for a brake light violation. Marcus became verbally aggressive. Marcus refused to comply with simple requests. When Derek attempted to place Marcus under arrest for obstruction, Marcus struck Derek in the chest with his forearm. Derek responded with appropriate force to subdue the suspect. Everything was by the book. Rebecca's cross-examination was surgical. She started with the brake light, asking Derek to explain exactly which light was out. Derek said the right rear brake light. Rebecca asked if he had documented this in his report. Derek said yes. Rebecca then displayed Derek's actual police report on the monitor, and there was no mention of which specific light was malfunctioning. Derek stammered, said he must have forgotten to include that detail. Rebecca moved on to the body camera. Officer Hastings, you were wearing a body camera during this incident, correct? Yes. And body cameras are designed to record all interactions between police and civilians, correct? Yes. So the jury should be able to watch your body camera footage and see exactly what happened, correct? Derek shifted in his seat. The camera malfunctioned. Malfunctioned how? It stopped recording during the arrest. How convenient. And when did you discover this malfunction? When I went to upload the footage later that night. And did you report this malfunction to your supervisor? Yes. And did you request a replacement camera? Derek hesitated. I don't recall. Rebecca pulled out another document. I have your equipment logs, Officer Hastings. There's no record of you reporting a malfunctioned body camera on the night of July 15th or any time in the following week. In fact, you used the same camera on 3 subsequent shifts. So either you continued using equipment you knew was broken, which violates department policy, or the camera didn't actually malfunction. Which is it? Derek's jaw clenched. I must have forgotten to file the report. You forgot to report broken equipment. You forgot to specify which brake light was out. You seem to forget a lot of important details, Officer Hastings. But you remember very clearly that Marcus Wallace struck you in the chest, don't you? Because it happened. Where exactly did he strike you? Upper chest area. Were you injured? Minor bruising. Did you seek medical attention? No, it wasn't necessary. Did you photograph the injury? No. Did you have another officer document the injury? No. So we have no physical evidence of this alleged assault, no body camera footage, and a surveillance video that shows Marcus Wallace never touching you at all. Is that accurate? The camera angle doesn't show everything. It shows enough, doesn't it, Officer Hastings? It shows you yanking an innocent man out of his car, slamming him against the hood, and punching him in the ribs. That's what happened, isn't it? That's not what happened. Then explain to this jury why Mr. Wallace would assault you for no reason during a traffic stop where he was fully complying with your orders. People like him don't need a reason. They just hate cops. Rebecca stopped. She looked at the jury, then back at Derek. People like him. What does that mean, Officer Hastings? Derek realized his mistake. I meant suspects. People who have run-ins with the law. But Marcus Wallace had never had a run-in with the law before this incident, had he? No arrests. No warrants. Not even a traffic ticket. So when you say, people like him, what exactly do you mean? Gerald Fisher stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness. Judge Henderson shook her head. Overruled. The witness will answer the question. Derek looked trapped. He looked angry. And he looked like exactly what he was. A cop who had spent 15 years abusing his power and had finally been caught. I meant people who don't respect authority, he said quietly. Or people who are black. Rebecca asked. Objection. Withdrawn, Rebecca said, turning away from Derek. No further questions. The prosecution rested. The defense rested. And then, on the 4th day of trial, Rebecca called one final witness. A witness she had saved for last because she knew the impact would be devastating. She called Officer Luis Mendoza. Luis walked to the witness stand like a man walking to his own execution. He was sworn in, stated his name and badge number, and sat down. He looked at Derek, who was staring at him with an expression that promised retribution. He looked at Marcus, who was watching him with cautious hope. And he looked at the jury, 12 people who would decide not just Marcus's fate, but in a way, Luis's fate too. Rebecca approached gently. Officer Mendoza, you were Officer Hastings's partner on the night of July 15th, correct? Yes, ma'am. You were present during the traffic stop of Marcus Wallace? Yes. You witnessed the entire interaction? Yes. Officer Mendoza, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer truthfully. Did you see Marcus Wallace strike Officer Hastings? The courtroom went completely silent. Derek leaned forward, his eyes boring into Luis. Gerald Fisher held his pen motionless above his notepad. Judge Henderson watched Luis carefully. And Luis Mendoza, a cop with 12 years on the force, a father of 2, a man who had spent 3 years documenting Derek's corruption while being too afraid to come forward, made the choice that would change everything. Luis looked at Derek. He looked at Marcus. Then he looked down at his hands and said, so quietly that people in the back rows had to strain to hear him, no. I didn't. The courtroom exploded. Gerald Fisher shot to his feet, objecting, demanding a sidebar. Judge Henderson's gavel came down hard, calling for order. Derek was halfway out of his seat before Sharon Yates grabbed his arm and forced him back down. And Rebecca Lawson simply nodded, because this was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the moment when the truth finally broke through the blue wall of silence. "Could you repeat that, Officer Mendoza?" Rebecca asked. Luis looked up, his eyes red. "No. I did not see Marcus Wallace strike Officer Hastings. He never touched him. Derek yanked him out of the car and hit him, and then Derek told me to say that Marcus assaulted him first. I lied in my report. I lied because I was afraid of what would happen if I told the truth. But I can't do it anymore. I can't keep lying." Derek was shaking now, his fists clenched on the table. Sharon Yates was whispering urgently to him, probably telling him to stay calm, to not make this worse. But Derek wasn't listening. Derek was watching his entire career, his entire life, collapse in front of him. And the worst part was knowing that there was nothing he could do to stop it. Rebecca asked Luis a few more questions, establishing that Derek had falsified his report, that this wasn't the first time Derek had done something like this, and that Luis had been documenting Derek's misconduct for years but had been too afraid to come forward. Then she thanked Luis and returned to her seat. Gerald Fisher declined to cross-examine. What could he possibly ask? Luis had just destroyed the prosecution's case. The trial was effectively over. Marcus Wallace was going to walk free, and Derek Hastings was going to face consequences for the first time in his 15-year career. Judge Henderson called a recess. As the courtroom cleared, Derek stood up and stared at Luis with pure hatred. Luis met his gaze and didn't look away. For 3 years, Luis had been afraid of this moment. But now that it was here, now that he had finally told the truth, he felt something unexpected. He felt relief. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could look at himself in the mirror again. That's when Simone Wallace was called to testify. And that's when everything went from bad to catastrophic for Derek Hastings. Because the woman he was about to assault in open court wasn't just Marcus's sister. She was about to become his boss. And Derek had no idea what was coming. Derek Hastings sat in a holding cell beneath the Baltimore County Courthouse, his dress uniform wrinkled, his badge sitting in an evidence bag somewhere upstairs, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of what he had done. The cell was small, 8 by 10 feet, with concrete walls painted an institutional beige and a metal bench bolted to the floor. Derek had put hundreds of people in cells like this over his 15-year career. He never imagined he would end up in one himself. But even now, even after everything that had happened in that courtroom, Derek still didn't fully understand the magnitude of his mistake. He thought he was facing contempt of court charges. Maybe assault charges. Maybe he would lose his job, have to fight to keep his pension, deal with some bad publicity. It would be rough, sure, but Derek had survived complaints before. He had connections. He had a union representative who could work miracles. He would fight this, and eventually, things would blow over. They always did. What Derek didn't know was that Simone Wallace had been wearing a wire. Not officially. Not as part of any police investigation. But after 22 years working in internal affairs, investigating corrupt officers, documenting abuse, Simone had learned one critical lesson: always record everything. You never knew when you would need evidence. You never knew when someone would lie about what was said, what happened, what they meant. So Simone had developed a habit of wearing a small digital recording device tucked into her clothing whenever she entered situations that might turn confrontational. When Simone had walked into courtroom 4B to testify as a character witness for her brother, she had been wearing that device. A tiny recorder no bigger than a USB drive, tucked into the inner pocket of her suit jacket. And it had captured everything. Every word Derek said. Every racist comment. Every threat. Every moment of escalation. And most importantly, the sound of that slap. Crystal clear. Undeniable. Admissible in court. 2 hours after Derek was dragged out of the courtroom, Simone sat in a small office at the courthouse with Rebecca Lawson and a federal agent named Marcus Chen from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Chen was in his early 40s, sharp-eyed and methodical, the kind of investigator who built cases brick by brick until they were absolutely unshakable. He had been tracking complaints about Baltimore County Police for 2 years, looking for patterns, waiting for the right case to justify federal intervention. When Rebecca called him about the courtroom incident, he came immediately. Simone handed Chen the recording device. Everything from this afternoon is on there. I haven't edited it. I haven't altered it. It's exactly what happened. Chen plugged the device into his laptop and hit play. The three of them sat in silence as Derek's voice filled the small office. You people always stick together, don't you? You and your brother, playing the victim card. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of people like you crying wolf every time you don't get your way. Then Simone's voice, calm and controlled. Excuse me, officer? Derek again, getting louder. You heard me. You know what your problem is? You think you're special. You think the rules don't apply to you. Well, I've got news for you, lady. Your brother assaulted me. Judge Henderson's voice in the background, ordering Derek to control himself. And then the sound that made all three of them wince. The sharp crack of Derek's palm against Simone's face. The gasp from the courtroom observers. The chaos that followed. Chen stopped the recording and looked at Simone. This is federal evidence now. Officer Hastings didn't just assault you. He violated your brother's civil rights by fabricating charges based on racial bias. The recording proves intent. It proves state of mind. Combined with Officer Mendoza's testimony and the surveillance footage, we have everything we need for a federal prosecution. How long? Simone asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. We'll need to interview witnesses, subpoena records, coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office. But this is solid. Derek Hastings is going to federal prison. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, a grim smile on her face. He thought he was untouchable. 15 years of complaints, and he genuinely believed nothing would ever stick. They always do, Chen said. Officers like Hastings operate with impunity for so long that they forget they're not actually above the law. They start to believe their own mythology. And then they make one mistake, one really catastrophic mistake, and everything comes crashing down. Simone touched her cheek where the mark from the slap was still visible. Make sure the charges stick, Agent Chen. Make sure he can't slip through the cracks again. Oh, he won't, Chen said. I can promise you that. What none of them knew at that moment was that across town, in a modest house in Essex, Luis Mendoza was having the most important conversation of his life. He sat at his kitchen table with his wife, Maria, and told her everything. Every lie he had written in a report. Every time he had watched Derek cross the line and said nothing. Every night he had come home and felt like he was drowning in guilt. Maria listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from shock to disappointment to something that looked almost like relief. I thought I was protecting us, Luis said, his voice breaking. I thought if I kept my head down, stayed quiet, I could keep my job and my pension and give you and the kids a good life. But I wasn't protecting anything. I was just destroying myself piece by piece. Maria reached across the table and took his hand. What are you going to do? I'm going to Internal Affairs tomorrow morning. I'm bringing everything. Everything? Every recording I made. Every note I took. Every case where Derek falsified evidence or filed false charges. I've been documenting it for 3 years. I kept telling myself I was waiting for the right time, but the truth is I was just afraid. I watched him slap that woman in court today, and something broke. I can't be part of this anymore. Maria squeezed his hand. You're going to lose your job. Probably. We might lose the house. Maybe. The other cops are going to hate you. Definitely. But you'll be able to sleep at night. Luis looked at his wife and felt tears burning in his eyes. Yeah. I'll be able to sleep at night. The next morning, Luis Mendoza walked into Baltimore County Police Headquarters carrying a laptop bag containing 3 years of evidence. He asked to speak with Internal Affairs, and 30 minutes later, he was sitting in an interview room across from 2 investigators who looked increasingly stunned as Luis laid out everything he had. Recordings of Derek bragging about teaching lessons to suspects. Copies of incident reports with inconsistencies and outright fabrications highlighted. A spreadsheet Luis had created listing 17 cases where Derek had manufactured evidence or filed false charges, complete with dates, case numbers, and the names of the victims. Why now? One of the investigators asked. Why are you coming forward after 3 years? Because I watched Officer Hastings slap a woman in open court yesterday, Luis said. And I realized that if I stayed silent any longer, I was just as guilty as he was. I'm done being part of the problem. The investigators looked at each other. This wasn't just about Derek Hastings anymore. This was about systemic corruption. This was about supervisors who had ignored complaints, union representatives who had protected bad cops, and a culture that valued loyalty over integrity. What Luis was handing them was a roadmap to the rot that had been festering in the department for years. Officer Mendoza, the lead investigator, said slowly, "Do you understand that this information implicates multiple officers? That this is going to trigger investigations that could take down people at every level of this department?" "I understand." "And you're willing to testify? To go on record? To face whatever consequences come from this?" "I am." "Then you need to know something. There's a new police chief starting on Monday. Her name is Simone Wallace. She's coming from Baltimore City, and her reputation is that she doesn't tolerate corruption. If you're serious about this, if you really want things to change, she's the person who can make it happen." Luis felt his stomach drop. Simone Wallace? The woman from the courtroom? That's her. She's Marcus Wallace's sister. And in 5 days, she's going to be running this department. Luis started laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because the universe had just delivered the most perfect justice he could imagine. Derek had slapped his future boss. And now Luis was about to hand that same boss all the evidence she needed to clean house. Over the next 4 days, the investigation Luis triggered moved faster than anyone expected. The internal affairs investigators brought in the FBI. The FBI brought in the U.S. attorney. The U.S. attorney started issuing subpoenas. And one by one, the truth about Derek Hastings and the officers who had protected him started coming to light. 4 officers were implicated in falsifying reports to cover for Derek. A sergeant named Bill Morrison was found to have buried at least 8 complaints about Derek's conduct over 5 years. A lieutenant named Robert Hayes had falsified an internal affairs investigation in 2021, deliberately omitting witness statements that contradicted Derek's version of events. The union representative, Tom Carlisle, was discovered to have pressured witnesses not to file complaints and had coordinated with department leadership to make problematic cases disappear. The rot went deeper than anyone imagined. And at the center of it all was Derek Hastings, who still sat in his cell thinking he could lawyer his way out of this, thinking his connections would save him, thinking that somehow, some way, he would come out on top like he always had. On Friday afternoon, 2 days before Simone Wallace's official start date as police chief, federal agents arrested Derek at the courthouse where he was waiting for his bail hearing on the contempt charges. They read him his rights and charged him with deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy against rights, and falsification of records in a federal investigation. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. Derek's lawyer, a private attorney he had hired after being released from the holding cell, tried to argue for bail. The federal prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Park who had built her career prosecuting civil rights violations, argued that Derek was a flight risk and a danger to witnesses. She played the recording Simone had made. She presented Luis Mendoza's evidence. She showed the pattern of abuse stretching back over 15 years. And the federal magistrate denied bail. Derek was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he looked genuinely afraid. Not angry. Not defiant. Afraid. Because federal charges weren't like state charges. Federal prosecutors didn't cut deals unless they absolutely had to. Federal judges didn't have sympathy for corrupt cops. And federal prisons didn't offer the kind of protective housing that state facilities sometimes provided for former law enforcement. Derek was going away for a long time. And everybody knew it. That same afternoon, Luis Mendoza received a phone call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously, expecting maybe a reporter or a lawyer or one of the many cops who now refused to speak to him. Instead, he heard a woman's voice. Calm, professional, familiar. Officer Mendoza, this is Captain Simone Wallace. I understand you've been cooperating with the investigation into Derek Hastings and others. I want you to know that I've reviewed the evidence you provided, and I'm impressed by your courage. It takes a special kind of strength to stand up against corruption from the inside, especially when you know it will cost you everything. Luis felt his throat tighten. Captain Wallace, I need to apologize. I should have come forward years ago. I should have told the truth in my initial report about your brother. I failed him, and I failed everyone Derek hurt because I was too afraid to do the right thing. You did the right thing eventually, Simone said. And that matters. I start as police chief on Monday, and one of my first priorities is going to be rebuilding trust in this department. I need officers who understand the difference between loyalty and complicity. Officers who will speak up when something is wrong, even when it's hard. I'm promoting you to sergeant, and I'm putting you in charge of a new unit focused on integrity and accountability. If you want the position. Luis couldn't speak for a moment. He had expected to be fired, shunned, destroyed. Instead, he was being promoted by the very woman whose family he had helped victimize. Captain, I don't deserve that. Maybe not, Simone said. But I don't need officers who are perfect. I need officers who are willing to do better. Are you willing to do better, Sergeant Mendoza? Yes, ma'am. I am. Then I'll see you Monday morning. Simone hung up, and Luis sat in his kitchen staring at his phone, tears running down his face. His wife came in, saw his expression, and asked if everything was okay. Luis looked up at her and smiled. For the first time in 3 years, everything was actually okay. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel like a fresh start. Simone Wallace stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 5:30 in the morning, adjusting the collar of her uniform. The Baltimore County Police Chief uniform. Dark navy blue with gold insignia, a badge that read Chief of Police in bold letters, and 4 stars on each shoulder that represented the weight of responsibility she was about to carry. Simone had worn a uniform for 22 years, but this one felt different. This one represented not just her career, but the hopes of everyone who had ever been failed by officers who abused their power. She touched her cheek where the mark from Derek's slap had finally faded. The bruise was gone, but the memory remained sharp. Good. She wanted to remember. She wanted to carry that moment with her as a reminder of why this work mattered, why accountability mattered, why she couldn't afford to let bad cops hide behind their badges ever again. At 7 o'clock, Simone walked through the front doors of Baltimore County Police Headquarters for the first time as chief. The building was a modern structure of glass and steel on the eastern edge of the county, with a lobby that featured photos of officers killed in the line of duty and a marble monument engraved with the department's motto, integrity, service, pride. Simone stood in front of that monument for a long moment, reading those words and thinking about how Derek Hastings had betrayed every single one of them. The morning briefing was scheduled for 8 o'clock. Every officer on duty would be there, along with supervisors, detectives, and administrative staff. Nearly 200 people packed into the main auditorium, and the energy in the room was electric with anticipation. Everyone knew about the courtroom incident. Everyone knew about the federal charges against Derek. Everyone knew about the internal affairs investigation that was still unfolding. And everyone knew that the woman Derek had slapped was about to walk onto that stage as their new boss. Simone entered from a side door and walked to the podium. The room fell silent. She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, some clearly hostile. She saw officers who had worked with Derek, who had probably covered for him at some point. She saw supervisors who had ignored complaints because it was easier than fighting the system. She saw young officers who had just joined the force and older ones who had seen chiefs come and go. And she saw Luis Mendoza sitting in the front row, wearing sergeant stripes that had been added to his uniform just that morning. "Good morning," Simone said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "My name is Chief Simone Wallace, and as of today, I am in command of this department. Some of you know me by reputation. Some of you know me because you watched one of your fellow officers assault me in a courtroom last week. And some of you are wondering right now whether I'm here for revenge." The room was so quiet that you could hear people breathing. "I'm not here for revenge," Simone continued. "I'm here for accountability. I'm here because this department has a problem. Not all of you. Not even most of you. But enough. Enough officers who think the badge gives them permission to abuse power. Enough supervisors who look the other way because it's easier than standing up. Enough of a culture that values loyalty over integrity. That ends today." Simone paused, letting her words sink in. She could see some officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others were nodding slowly, as if they had been waiting years to hear someone say these things out loud. "Over the next few months, we're going to implement changes. New body camera policies with independent oversight. A civilian review board with real authority to investigate complaints. Mandatory training on de-escalation and implicit bias. And a new integrity unit, led by Sergeant Luis Mendoza, that will investigate misconduct allegations without interference from union representatives or department politics." She looked directly at Luis, who met her gaze with an expression of determined gratitude. "Sergeant Mendoza came forward last week with evidence of corruption that went back years. He risked everything to tell the truth. That's the kind of officer I want in this department. Not perfect people, but people who are willing to do the right thing even when it costs them." Simone clicked a remote, and a photograph appeared on the screen behind her. It was Derek Hastings in his dress uniform, taken at some department ceremony years ago. He was smiling, confident, the picture of a decorated officer. Derek Hastings worked for this department for 15 years. He had 17 official complaints filed against him. Excessive force. Falsifying reports. Racial profiling. And for 15 years, the system protected him. Supervisors ignored the complaints. Internal affairs closed investigations without proper review. Union representatives made problems disappear. And Derek kept his badge, kept his authority, and kept hurting people. She clicked to the next slide. It was a mugshot of Derek from his federal arrest, looking scared and small. This is Derek now. Facing federal civil rights charges. Facing 20 years in federal prison. Facing the consequences that should have come years ago if this department had done its job. Another click. This time it was a series of photographs. 17 faces. 17 people Derek had falsely arrested, assaulted, or abused over his career. These are his victims. 17 people whose lives were damaged or destroyed because one officer thought he was above the law. 17 people who filed complaints that were buried or dismissed. 17 people who deserved justice and didn't get it until it was almost too late. Simone turned back to face the auditorium. My first official act as chief is this: I am personally meeting with every single one of these victims. I am apologizing on behalf of this department. I am reviewing their cases to determine if charges should be expunged, if settlements should be offered, if there is any way we can make right what was done to them. Because accountability doesn't just mean punishing bad cops. It means acknowledging the harm they caused and doing everything in our power to repair it. She could see tears in some officers' eyes now. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. Relief that someone was finally saying what needed to be said. Relief that maybe, just maybe, things were actually going to change. My second act is implementing a new body camera policy effective immediately. All cameras will upload footage directly to an independent server that cannot be accessed or edited by officers. Any officer whose camera mysteriously malfunctions during a critical incident will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. No exceptions. No excuses. A few officers in the back exchanged glances. Simone saw it and addressed it directly. I know some of you think this shows a lack of trust. You're right. Trust has to be earned. And this department has not earned the trust of the community we serve. We're going to earn it back by being transparent, by being accountable, and by proving that we're here to protect everyone, not just the people who look like us or think like us or come from the same neighborhoods as us. She clicked to the final slide. It was the department motto again: integrity, service, pride. But underneath, she had added new words: these aren't just ideals. They're requirements. If you can't meet these requirements, if you can't commit to treating every person with dignity regardless of their race or income or background, if you think the badge gives you power over people instead of responsibility to them, then you don't belong in this department. Hand in your resignation and save us both the trouble. Simone closed her folder and looked out at the silent auditorium one more time. But if you're here because you genuinely want to serve, if you became a cop because you believe in justice and protecting the vulnerable and making your community safer, then I want you here. I need you here. And together, we're going to rebuild this department into something we can all be proud of. She stepped away from the podium, and for a long moment, no one moved. Then Luis Mendoza stood up and started clapping. Slowly, hesitantly at first, others joined him. Within seconds, half the auditorium was on their feet, applauding. Not everyone. Some officers sat with their arms crossed, clearly unhappy with what they had just heard. But enough. Enough good cops who had been waiting for leadership that actually meant what it said. Simone walked off the stage and spent the next 2 hours in one-on-one meetings with department leadership. She fired 3 supervisors who had actively covered up complaints against Derek and other officers. She placed 2 more on administrative leave pending investigation. She reorganized the chain of command to break up the networks of protection that had allowed corruption to flourish. And she made it clear that anyone who retaliated against officers who reported misconduct would be terminated immediately. At noon, Simone kept her promise. She met with the first of Derek's victims, a man named Terrence Brown who had been falsely arrested for drug possession 3 years earlier. Derek had planted evidence during a traffic stop, and Terrence had spent 6 months in jail before the charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. He lost his job, his apartment, and custody of his daughter during those 6 months. And until Luis came forward with proof that Derek had falsified the arrest report, Terrence had no way to clear his name. Terrence sat across from Simone in her new office, his expression guarded and skeptical. He had been failed by the system too many times to trust easily. Simone understood that. She didn't ask him to trust her. She simply told him the truth. Mr. Brown, I'm Chief Simone Wallace. I'm here to tell you that Derek Hastings lied in his report about your arrest. We have evidence proving he planted the drugs in your vehicle. Your arrest record is being expunged. The county is prepared to offer a settlement for wrongful arrest. And I am personally apologizing for what was done to you. Terrence stared at her. You're apologizing? Yes. You weren't even here when it happened. No. But I'm here now. And I'm responsible for making sure it never happens again. Terrence's eyes filled with tears. I lost everything because of that arrest. My job. My home. My little girl. Do you know what it's like to have your daughter look at you through a glass window in a jail visiting room and ask why you can't come home? Do you know what it's like to tell her you didn't do anything wrong but nobody believes you? I can't undo what happened to you, Simone said quietly. I can't give you back those 6 months. But I can make sure Derek Hastings pays for what he did. And I can make sure this department does better. Terrence wiped his eyes. Is he really going to prison? Yes. Federal prison. For a long time. Good. That's good. Simone met with 16 more victims over the next 2 weeks. Each meeting was different, but the theme was the same. Derek had targeted people who were vulnerable, people who had no power to fight back, people who the system had already failed. And each time Simone apologized, each time she promised accountability, she felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. This wasn't just about Derek. This was about rebuilding trust that had been destroyed over years, over decades. Meanwhile, Derek's trial moved forward with brutal efficiency. The federal prosecutor, Jennifer Park, built a case so airtight that Derek's lawyer advised him to take a plea deal. Derek refused. He still believed, right up until the jury came back, that somehow he would be acquitted. That somehow his 15 years of service would count for something. That somehow the system that had protected him for so long would protect him one more time. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found Derek guilty on all counts. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Conspiracy against rights. Falsification of records. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Chen who had zero tolerance for corrupt law enforcement, sentenced Derek to 8 years in federal prison. No parole. No early release. 8 full years. She also ordered him stripped of his pension, banned from ever working in law enforcement again, and required to pay restitution to his victims. Derek broke down in the courtroom. He cried, begged, pleaded for mercy. His wife, who had filed for divorce 2 weeks earlier, wasn't there to see it. His friends from the department, the ones who had covered for him and protected him, had all disappeared. The union representative who had spun his misconduct for 15 years had declined to comment to reporters. Derek was alone. Completely alone. And as the marshals led him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, all he could think about was that moment in courtroom 4B when he raised his hand and slapped Simone Wallace. The moment that destroyed everything. 6 months after Derek was sentenced, Marcus Wallace married Keisha in a small ceremony at a church in West Baltimore. Simone gave a toast at the reception, standing in front of family and friends with a glass of champagne raised high. To my brother Marcus, who survived something no innocent person should ever have to endure. To Keisha, who stood by him when things were darkest. And to justice. Real justice. The kind that takes time, that requires courage, that demands we never stop fighting for what's right. Marcus, you could have been broken by what Derek Hastings did to you. Instead, you're stronger. And you're proof that good people can survive bad systems and come out the other side with their integrity intact. Marcus stood and hugged his sister, and everyone in that room understood what they were really celebrating. Not just a wedding, but the victory of truth over lies, of justice over corruption, of hope over despair. In Baltimore County Police Headquarters, Derek's story became legend. Officers whispered about it in roll calls and briefings. The cop who thought he was untouchable. The cop who slapped a black woman in court not knowing she would be his boss in 7 days. The cop who finally faced consequences after 15 years of getting away with everything. It became a warning, a reminder, a lesson that every new recruit heard during their first week. No one is above the law. No one. Not even cops. Chief Simone Wallace's photograph hangs in the lobby of Baltimore County Police Headquarters now, right next to the monument with the department motto. Under her picture is a plaque that reads, "Integrity isn't just about following the rules. It's about standing up when those rules are broken, even when it costs you everything. Especially when it costs you everything." Simone sees that plaque every morning when she walks into work. She touches it sometimes, remembering that day in the courtroom, remembering the sound of that slap, remembering the moment when everything changed. And she thinks about karma. How it's not magic or fate or divine intervention. Karma is just consequences. The natural result of actions taken without thought for who they might hurt. Derek Hastings spent 15 years believing he would never face consequences. And when they finally came, they came with perfect timing. Justice might be slow. Justice might take years to arrive. But justice never forgets. And for the 17 people Derek hurt, for Marcus who spent months fighting false charges, for Luis who finally found the courage to speak up, for every victim of police abuse who thought the system would never care about them, justice finally came. Not perfect. Not complete. But real. And in Baltimore County, under Chief Simone Wallace's leadership, that justice continues every single day. One decision at a time. One policy at a time. One officer held accountable at a time. Because that's how real change happens. Not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but with consistent, unwavering commitment to doing what's right even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Derek Hastings sits in a federal prison cell now, thinking about that slap every single day. Thinking about the woman whose face he struck without knowing who she was, what she would become, how much power she would have over his fate. And he understands now, too late, the lesson that Simone Wallace has been teaching her entire career. The badge doesn't make you powerful. Character makes you powerful. Integrity makes you powerful. And the moment you forget that, the moment you think your authority gives you the right to hurt people without consequences, that's the moment karma starts counting down to your reckoning. 7 days. That's all it took. 7 days between the worst decision of Derek's life and the beginning of his downfall. 7 days between arrogance and accountability. 7 days between thinking he was untouchable and learning that everyone, eventually, gets exactly what they deserve. What a story this turned out to be. A story about justice, family, courage, and the long arc of karma bending exactly where it should. Right toward the truth. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and accountability and the courage it takes to stand up against corruption, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment about what part hit you the hardest. And remember, you never know who you're mistreating. You never know whose life you're impacting. You never know when karma is watching. Treat people with respect. Stand up for what's right. And trust that eventually, justice finds its way to everyone. Subscribe to Black Lives Stories for more true tales of karma and justice. Because these stories matter. And the people in them matter. Every single one of them.